It is 3:13 a.m. on the 17th of August 1942, and Private First Class Ed Weigel is soaked to the bone in the well of a rubber landing boat 40 miles east of Butaratari Island. The Pacific swell lifts the boat and drops it again and again, and the outboard motor beneath his hand keeps drowning in spray. Around him, 17 other Marines grip their paddles, rifles slung muzzle down against the rain. Somewhere ahead in the darkness lies a narrow strip of coral and palm trees called Makin atoll, part of the Gilbert Islands, held by a Japanese garrison that has no idea what is about to arrive on its beach. Behind them, 2 American submarines, USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut, sit low and dark on the surface, having just disgorged 221 men of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion into the night. The plan calls for a quiet landing on Butaratari's ocean side, a swift assault on the small garrison holding the atoll, the destruction of stores and radio equipment, and a return to the submarines before daylight exposes them. Nothing about the plan will survive contact with the surf, the terrain, or the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, a lean, unconventional officer who has studied guerrilla tactics in China, sits in another boat, watching his formation scatter in the swell. Beside him is Major James Roosevelt, son of the President of the United States, serving as executive officer. Within hours, a raid, meant to be swift and surgical, will become a chaotic, bloody fight for survival on a strip of sand barely wider than a cricket pitch. And 9 of these men will be left behind to a fate that will not become known to their families for years. The Makin raid did not happen in isolation. By August 1942, the United States had been at war with Japan for 8 months, and the news from the Pacific had been almost uniformly grim. Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines had fallen. 10 days earlier, on August 7th, the 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, opening America's first major land offensive of the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his planners wanted something to divert Japanese attention away from that vulnerable beachhead, and they wanted a propaganda victory the American public could read about over breakfast. Evans Carlson had spent years observing the Chinese 8th Route Army fighting the Japanese, and he returned convinced that small, self-sufficient units built on egalitarian discipline could outfight larger conventional forces. He coined the motto gung ho, borrowed from a Chinese phrase meaning work together, and stamped it onto the 2nd Raider Battalion he now commanded. The unit trained at Camp Elliott in California, running long marches and live-fire exercises that stripped away peacetime spit and polish. Makin atoll itself was a minor outpost, garrisoned by a Japanese Special Naval Landing Force estimated at somewhere between 70 and 90 men, tasked with running a seaplane base and a wireless station on Butaratari Island. It was not a fortress. It was a picket, 3,000 kilometers from Pearl Harbor and roughly 2,000 from Guadalcanal, chosen precisely because it looked achievable. Carlson's raiders left Pearl Harbor aboard the 2 submarines on August 8th, spending 9 cramped days submerged by day and running on the surface by night, sharing bunks in rotating shifts, breathing air thick with diesel fumes, until they reached their launch point off Makin in the small hours of August 17th. The landing itself began to unravel within minutes. Rubber boats swamped in the surf, engines choked with salt water, and platoons that were meant to land together In a single wave, instead came ashore, scattered along nearly a mile of beach, some units missing their objectives entirely. Then, as the raiders crept toward the tree line, a Marine's rifle discharged by accident. The single shot ended any hope of surprise and brought the Japanese garrison awake and firing within moments. What followed was not the clean, one-sided ambush the mission briefing had promised, but a running, close-quarters fight through palm groves and along a coastal track, Marines and Japanese defenders sometimes fewer than 20 meters apart. Carlson pushed his companies forward in a rough pincer along the island's spine, trying to encircle the garrison's main position near the lagoon side. Sergeant Clyde Thomason, leading a section forward under fire, was killed rallying his men against a machine gun position. He would later become the first enlisted Marine of the Second World War to receive the Medal of Honor. By mid-morning, the Japanese had thrown in everything they had, including at least one desperate charge into the Marine line that was cut down at close range. Then, around noon, 2 Japanese aircraft appeared overhead, strafing the beach, and the men still trying to reorganize near the boats, followed later by a larger flight of bombers and float planes launched from bases at Jaluit and further afield. The raiders had no anti-aircraft weapons beyond rifles, and Browning automatics pointed skyward, and the attacks forced them to scatter into cover repeatedly through the afternoon, breaking up what little cohesion remained in the assault. For the Marines on the beach, the fight was now less about Butaritari's garrison and more about the ocean itself. The same surf that had swamped the landing now made re-embarkation nearly impossible. Boat after boat launched into the breakers, only to be flipped, swamped, or driven back onto the sand, engines fouled beyond restarting. Some men paddled with rifle butts and hands when motors failed. A handful of strong swimmers, including Sergeant Victor Magakian, hauled boats through the surf line by main force, timing their pushes between wave sets. Carlson, watching companies of exhausted, soaked Marines failing again and again to get past the breakers, briefly signalled that he was prepared to surrender, rather than see his battalion annihilated on the beach, a decision he reversed within the hour. Once officers convinced him resistance was still possible, and the garrison itself was nearly finished. On the Japanese side, the defenders who remained alive were now fighting with dwindling ammunition against a force that still heavily outnumbered them, and by that evening, organised resistance on Butaritari had effectively collapsed. The wireless station had been destroyed, fuel stores burned, and documents seized, but the raiders were now trapped on a beach they could not leave, with 2 submarines waiting offshore that could not risk daylight exposure indefinitely. If this deep dive into a nearly forgotten Pacific raid is holding your attention, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think. Night brought no relief. Through the hours of darkness on the 17th and into the 18th of August, small groups of Marines kept trying the surf in what boats remained seaworthy, some succeeding, some capsizing again just short of the submarines. Carlson organised what men he could into a defensive perimeter, uncertain how many Japanese defenders were still capable of fighting, and unaware that the garrison had in fact been almost entirely destroyed. Reports reaching him were fragmentary, carried by runners moving through darkened palm groves rather than radio, since much of the battalion's communications equipment had failed or been lost in the surf. By the morning of the 18th, roughly 100 raiders remained ashore, while the rest had reached the submarines overnight. a local outrigger canoe borrowed with the help of islanders on Butaritari, and a motorised native boat helped ferry the last exhausted groups out through a calmer channel later that day, allowing Nautilus and Argonaut to finally recover the bulk of the battalion by the evening of August 18th. In the chaos of the withdrawal, in the confusion of moving in darkness between rally points that shifted hour to hour, 9 Marines were left behind on the island. Some accounts suggesting they were asleep or separated during a final consolidation that nobody realised was incomplete. The submarines, unable to linger, submerged and turned for Pearl Harbor, carrying home a battalion that had lost dozens of men and left 9 more unaccounted for on a beach 3,000 kilometres from home. The immediate cost of the raid, on paper, looked survivable. 18 Marines killed in the fighting on Butaritari, a number later revised as records were reconciled against a Japanese garrison that had been almost completely wiped out. The 9 men left behind were, for months, simply listed as missing. What actually happened to them did not reach American authorities until years later through captured Japanese documents and post-war investigation. The 9 had been captured alive by Japanese forces who returned to reoccupy Makin, held for a period, and then transported to Kwajalein Atoll, where on October 16th, 1942, they were executed by beheading on the direct order of Vice Admiral Koso Abe, commander of the Marshall Islands Defense Sector. Abe was tried by an American military tribunal after the war and hanged in 1947 for this and related war crimes, one of the clearer instances of documented justice for the killing of American prisoners in the Pacific Theater. For the families of the 9, the truth arrived only gradually, first as missing, then years later, as confirmed dead, a delay that compounded grief with a long, uncertain waiting. What shifted permanently after Makin was not the fate of one small atoll, but the way both sides thought about the Gilbert Islands. American newspapers, hungry for any good news after months of retreat, splashed the raid across front pages as a daring strike deep into Japanese-held territory, and James Roosevelt's participation guaranteed it presidential-level attention. The battalion returned to a hero's welcome, and Colson's gung-ho philosophy entered the American vocabulary permanently, well beyond any military context. But military planners drew a harder lesson from the operation's near disaster. Submarine-launched raids using rubber boats against defended beaches were extraordinarily risky. An amphibious doctrine would need far more robust landing craft, better communications, and tighter command control than Makin had shown. On the Japanese side, the raid triggered exactly the kind of overreaction that sometimes follows a stinging, embarrassing defeat. Convinced the Gilbert Islands might be the target of a larger American offensive, Japanese commanders poured resources into fortifying the atoll chain, above all a small coral outpost called Tarawa, turning it over the following year into one of the most heavily defended beaches in the Pacific War. When American Marines returned to the Gilberts in November 1943, they landed not against 70 lightly armed defenders, but against nearly 5,000 entrenched Japanese troops at Tarawa, and the resulting 3-day battle cost over 1,000 American lives, a grim and largely unintended consequence traced by many historians directly back to the fright Carlson's raiders gave the Japanese High Command in August 1942. In the years that followed, the Makin raid settled into an odd place in American memory. Celebrated at the time as a triumph of daring, reassessed afterward as a costly, poorly coordinated operation whose real strategic value was modest at best. Evans Carlson himself continued to command the 2nd Raider Battalion through the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal later in 1942, before health problems eventually forced him from active combat command. He died in 1947. The same year, Vice Admiral Abe was executed for ordering the deaths of the 9 Marines left on Makin's Beach. The raid's true legacy lies less in the coral and ash of Bataratari and more in the chain of consequences it set in motion. A small, chaotic dawn action that helped harden Tarawa into a fortress, and in doing so, helped write one of the costliest single days in Marine Corps history a little over a year later. Ed Wiggle survived the surf, survived the strafing runs, and survived the desperate night swim back to Nautilus, one of the fortunate majority who made it off Butaratari's beach before the submarines submerged for home. He carried the memory of that dawn landing for the rest of his life, the failed engines, the accidental shot that gave away the entire operation, the palm groves lit by muzzle flashes, and the 9 names of men who never made it back to the boats. What began as a single wave of rubber craft pushing through darkness toward an unsuspecting garrison ended 18 months later in the ruins of Tarawa, a straight and unbroken line from one dawn raid to another, written not in strategy documents, but in the blood of men who never knew each other's names.